It was one of those calm mornings when the air feels new and the world still half asleep. The man stepped out of his small house at the edge of town, a mug of coffee in his hand. The quiet suited him. He liked hearing the wind moving through the trees, the faint hum of cars far away, and the soft sound of paws behind him. His dog followed, wagging his tail like always. The man had built his days around peace. After years of noise, he finally lived where no one asked questions, no one shouted orders, and no one tried to find out who he used to be. The world saw him as an ordinary man with a gentle way of speaking, and a strong build that hinted at a past that wasn't ordinary at all. But no one really knew. He liked it that way. His dog, a strong and intelligent shepherd mix, had been his closest companion since the old days. They had trained together, worked together, and once depended on each other in places most people couldn't imagine. Now they spent their mornings walking down the dirt road, greeting the sun and returning home for breakfast. The bond between them was quiet but deep. The man often said more with a glance than most do with words, and the dog understood every look. The neighbors saw the two every morning. Some waved, some just watched. They didn't know the dog had been trained to detect danger, that he once knew how to move in complete silence, or that he could tell a friendly knock from a threat in an instant. To them, he was just a large dog who seemed too serious sometimes, sitting by the gate as if guarding something precious. That morning, a delivery truck rolled past a little too close, and the driver tossed a package carelessly into the yard. It landed with a loud thud, startling the dog. He barked, one sharp sound that echoed through the neighborhood. The man calmed him with a single word, and just like that, the dog stopped, his tail lowering as he waited for another command. It was simple trust, one that came from years of being side by side in moments that once meant life or death. A few houses down, a neighbor peered through her window. She didn't like big dogs. She had complained before to others, saying the dog scared her children. That morning, when she heard the bark, she told herself it was a sign the animal was dangerous. She made a call, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. She didn't know the story. She didn't know what that dog meant to the man, or that the bark she heard was not a threat but a moment of instinct. The man spent the rest of the morning fixing a loose fence panel. The sun was rising higher, warming the yard. His dog followed him from one side of the fence to the other, tail swinging lazily, happy just to be near him. At noon, the man sat on the porch with a sandwich in hand and tossed a small piece of meat to the dog, who caught it mid-air with precision. They both seemed content in their small corner of the world. Hours later, 2 police vehicles pulled slowly into the street. The man didn't notice at first. He was in the backyard, setting down a new water bowl for the dog. The dog noticed before he did, ears lifting, body tense, the faint sound of car doors closing triggering the kind of alertness that never truly left him. He moved toward the gate, not barking, just watching. The man turned when he heard the faint crunch of boots on gravel. 2 uniformed officers approached the fence. They looked cautious but not hostile. One had his hand near his sidearm, a habit more than a threat, the man thought. Still, he didn't like it. "Afternoon, sir," one officer said. "We got a call about an aggressive dog in the area. Is this your property?" The man nodded. "It is. There's no aggressive dog here, only him." He pointed toward the shepherd, who stood quietly beside him. "He barked at a truck earlier, that's all." The man continued calmly. "He's trained, he won't harm anyone unless told to." The officers exchanged a glance. They didn't seem convinced. One of them stepped closer, peering through the fence. "Mind if we come in to check?" The man hesitated. He didn't like strangers in his yard, and the dog could sense his unease. The shepherd moved slightly forward, tail stiff but still silent, eyes focused. "He's fine," the man said. "You don't need to," but before he could finish, the second officer unlatched the gate. It swung open and everything changed in an instant. The dog took a single step forward, not lunging, just placing himself between the man and the strangers. The officers mistook the movement for aggression. The man raised his voice. "Don't move! He's just protecting!" But his words tangled with theirs as one officer shouted, "Get back!" The dog froze, uncertain which command to follow. The tension thickened in the air like storm clouds forming. Then came the sound, sharp, final, echoing. The man didn't process it right away. His mind went blank for a heartbeat. He turned and saw his companion collapse onto the dry grass. The world seemed to slow down. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, calling his name softly, his voice trembling. The dog looked up at him one last time, eyes calm, as if saying he understood. Then there was stillness. The officer shouted something, and maybe instructions, maybe apologies, but their words never reached him. All he could hear was the silence that followed. He sat there, hand on the dog's fur, staring at nothing. His breathing was slow, too controlled, as if a lifetime of training was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. The man who once led soldiers into impossible missions now sat helpless, unable to save the only life that had stood by him through everything. One officer stepped closer, his voice softening. "Sir, we didn't mean—" "Stop talking," the man said quietly without looking up. There was no anger in his tone, just a kind of heavy finality that made the officer step back. Neighbors began to gather at the edge of their yards, whispering. Some took out their phones. The man lifted the dog carefully and carried him inside the house. No one followed. The officers stood there, unsure what to do, the weight of their mistake sinking in slowly. Inside, the man laid the dog down on a blanket near the back door, the same spot where he always napped. He sat beside him for a long time, not moving. On the wall above were framed photos of them in uniform, both younger, both standing proud in places far away. In those pictures, the dog wore a small patch on his vest, a mark of service and loyalty. Hours passed before the man stepped outside again. The sun had gone down and the lights of the police cars painted the street in blue and red. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply looked at the officers and said, "Leave." His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made them obey without another word. That night, the house stayed dark. The man sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space near his chair. Every sound outside felt distant, like it came from another world. He thought about the day he brought the dog home from the base, about the long rides they took after missions, about the way the dog would rest his head on his knee whenever he was lost in thought. He whispered softly, "You did your job like always." Sleep didn't come that night. He kept going over the moment again and again, trying to understand how something so small, a simple misunderstanding, it could take away something so pure. By morning, the neighborhood was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. Word had spread about what happened. Some people felt sorry. Others defended the officers, saying they were just doing their job. But those who knew the man could see the difference in him now. The easy calm was gone. He moved slower, spoke less, and when he walked past the gate, his eyes no longer met anyone else's. Still, he carried himself with a kind of dignity that made others hesitate before speaking. No one knew his story, and not yet. They didn't know the medals hidden in a box under his bed, the missions no one could ever talk about, or that he had once led teams into the most dangerous places on Earth and brought every one of them back. Now he walked alone. But even in silence, there was something unshakable about him. The same quiet strength that had carried him through battlefields and losses much deeper than most could bear. And though the world had taken his last companion, the way he stood that morning, calm and still in the yard where it happened, made it clear he wasn't broken. He was waiting. For truth. For peace. Maybe for something more. The next morning came quietly, like the world was holding its breath. The man sat by the window, staring at the empty space in the yard where his dog used to wait for him every sunrise. The food bowl was still there, half full, beside the spot where he had always placed the water dish. Nothing had been moved. He couldn't bring himself to touch any of it. He hadn't slept. His eyes were open through the night, watching the faint line of light crawl slowly across the floor as the moon moved past. Sometimes he would think he heard footsteps, his dog's familiar sound across the wooden floor, but each time it was just the wind or the creak of the old house. When the morning light finally came, the street outside was already busy. News had spread overnight. People whispered and cars slowed as they passed his home. Some were curious, others were angry. A few came with kind words, but he didn't answer the door. He didn't need pity. He needed silence. By noon there was a knock he couldn't ignore. It was a local officer, not one of the men from yesterday, but a younger one who looked nervous. He took off his cap and stood at the door like he didn't know where to begin. "Sir," he said softly, "I'm here to tell you the department is looking into the incident. There'll be an internal review." The man just nodded. He didn't invite him in, and the officer didn't expect to be. "I'm sorry," the young man added after a moment. "No one wanted this to happen." The man finally looked at him. His eyes were tired but steady. "I know," he said quietly. "But it did." The officer hesitated, then nodded respectfully and left. The man closed the door and stood there for a long moment before leaning against it. His hand pressed to the wood like he was holding back a wave he didn't want to show. He went back to the kitchen and opened the drawer that held old photos. There weren't many. He had never been the type to keep memories on paper, but there were a few that mattered. In one, the dog sat beside him on a dusty road overseas. They both looked younger, leaner, and their eyes told a story only those who had been there would understand. He placed the photo on the table, staring at it as the sun shifted through the blinds. That evening, a neighbor came by with a covered dish. She had always been polite, never close, but kind in her way. She set the food down and said softly, "I don't know what to say, but I'm sorry for what happened." He thanked her, though his voice was almost a whisper. She stood there for a moment longer, then said, "They're talking about it on the news. People are asking questions." "It shouldn't have happened." He didn't answer. She gave him a small nod and left. When he was alone again, he sat on the porch and watched the sky change colors. He thought about all the times he had been in danger and survived. He thought about how many times his dog had been there to pull him back from harm. It was strange how fate could take everything in 1 second, not in a fight or a mission, but in the safety of home. The following day, reporters began showing up. They didn't know much about him, only that something had happened between the police and a man whose dog was shot. They wanted a statement. He refused to speak. The microphones and cameras stayed on his street for 2 days, then slowly disappeared when he didn't give them a story. But one person didn't leave. It was a woman from a small local paper. She didn't bring a camera or ask him questions from behind a gate. She just left a note on his porch that said, "I'd like to tell your story, if you ever want it told your way." He didn't answer right away. For a week, the note sat untouched, weighed down by a small stone so the wind wouldn't take it. Meanwhile, the officers involved were placed under review. The department tried to handle it quietly, but whispers grew louder. People in town argued online. Some defended the police. Others demanded accountability. Through it all, the man stayed silent. He went about his days the same way. Early mornings, long walks alone, no words to anyone. But something inside him had changed. The calm that once defined him had turned into a deep stillness. It wasn't anger. It was something heavier, something that came from carrying too much for too long. One evening, just after sunset, he finally picked up the note from the porch and called the number written on it. The woman's voice on the other end was soft and respectful. She said she didn't want to sensationalize what happened. She just wanted the truth, his truth. He agreed to meet her at a quiet diner on the edge of town. When she arrived, she didn't open a notebook or a recorder right away. She simply sat and listened. He didn't talk much at first, but when he finally began, the words came slowly, carefully, like pieces of a story he hadn't told in years. He told her about the dog, how he had been part of his unit, trained to protect soldiers, how they had served together in places far from home. The woman listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with the kind of respect that comes from truly hearing someone. When he mentioned what happened that day, his voice didn't rise. It didn't break. It stayed calm, but every word carried weight. They didn't see a man and his dog, he said. They saw a threat, and they acted on fear. The woman nodded slowly, writing only a few lines. "Would you want me to share your name?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "No names, just the truth. That's enough." When the story was published a week later, it was short, quiet, and powerful. It didn't mention his military background. She had promised to keep that private. But it told of a man who lost his best friend to a misunderstanding. It spoke about restraint, about judgment, and about how fear can cloud reason. The article spread faster than anyone expected. People began talking about the need for change, not with anger, but with empathy. At first, he didn't know the article had reached so far. Then letters started arriving at his doorstep. Some were from strangers who had lost pets in similar ways. Others were from veterans who understood what it meant to lose a partner, even one with 4 legs. Each letter carried stories of pain, healing, and quiet support. He didn't answer most of them, but he read every one. A week later, someone knocked on his door again. This time it was one of the officers from that day, the younger one. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his hat. "Sir," he began, his voice unsteady, "I came to say I'm sorry. For that day. For what happened. We didn't know who you were. We didn't know." The man looked at him for a long moment. The air between them was heavy but not hostile. "You don't have to know who a man is," he said quietly. "You just have to see him." The officer's eyes filled with guilt. "I know. I know that now." The man nodded once, then closed the door gently, not in anger but in quiet forgiveness. It was the only thing he could give. That night he went outside and stood by the fence. The moonlight fell on the empty space where his dog used to sit. The grass had grown there, uneven and untouched since that day. He knelt down and brushed his hand through it, feeling the cool blades against his fingers. For a long time he stayed there in silence, the same way he used to sit with his dog after long days, just breathing the night air, letting the quiet speak for both of them. Somewhere deep inside, a small peace began to return, not the same peace he had before, but a fragile one built on acceptance. He didn't know that people across the state were now talking about his story. The department had quietly begun changing how animal calls were handled, introducing new steps to prevent mistakes like this from happening again. His silence had done more than shouting ever could. In the days that followed, he went back to his routines. He still woke early, still took walks at dawn even though the space beside him was empty. But there was a difference in the way he carried himself. It was like he had found a way to live with the loss, to turn it into something meaningful. The people who once only saw him as a quiet man now looked at him differently. Some greeted him with respect, others with apology. He never asked for any of it. He just wanted to move forward one steady step at a time. And though the house remained quiet, it no longer felt hollow. He kept the dog's collar hanging by the door and the old photos on the wall. Every morning he'd glance at them before stepping outside, a small smile touching his face as if he was saying, "I'm still here, and so are you." The world, in its own way, was beginning to listen. The days slowly turned into weeks and the quiet town began to move on. News faded, people found new things to talk about, and the noise that once surrounded the man's house grew still again. But inside, time didn't move the same way. Every day felt heavy, like it carried a shadow that refused to lift. He kept busy. That was how he had always survived, by keeping his hands occupied when his mind felt too full. He worked on small repairs around the house, cleaned tools that didn't need cleaning, fixed things that weren't broken. It wasn't about the work. It was about keeping himself from thinking too long. Every morning he still opened the door, expecting to see his dog waiting, tail wagging, ready for their usual walk. And every morning the empty yard reminded him of what he'd lost. He would stand there for a moment, breathing in the air before forcing himself to move. Some habits were too deep to let go. One afternoon, while he was trimming the overgrown bushes near the fence, an envelope slid under his gate. It had no return address, only his name written in uneven handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from someone who claimed to have served in the same unit years ago. The letter began, "I saw the article. I knew it had to be you." The writer shared how word of what happened had reached old teammates. They remembered his calm leadership, his quiet strength. Many had stories about him and his dog, how the two were inseparable, how the dog had saved lives during missions. The letter ended with a few simple words. "You're not forgotten. Neither is he." The man folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the others he'd received. He didn't reply, but he read it again later that night, sitting at the table with the soft hum of the fridge filling the silence. For the first time in weeks, he felt something that wasn't pain. It was connection. A few days later, the same reporter who had written his story came back to see him. She called ahead, asking politely if she could stop by. He thought for a moment before saying yes. When she arrived, she brought no camera, no microphone, just a notebook tucked under her arm in that same respectful tone she'd had before. "I wanted to tell you something," she said as they sat outside on the porch. "After the article was published, a group of veterans reached out. They want to honor your dog. They say he deserves recognition for his service." The man looked at her, his face calm but unreadable. "He wouldn't have cared about medals," he said softly. "He just wanted to work." "I know," she said. "But sometimes it's not for them, it's for us. For people to remember what loyalty looks like." He didn't answer right away. He looked toward the yard where the sun was setting in streaks of gold. After a long pause, he said, If it helps someone remember, then it's worth it. A week later, she returned with more news. A memorial was being planned by a local veteran organization. It wasn't a large event, just a small gathering to recognize animals that had served alongside soldiers. They wanted to include his dog's name on a plaque. At first, he hesitated to attend. He didn't like attention, but something in him knew he needed to go, not for recognition, but for closure. So when the day came, he put on a clean shirt, took the old collar that hung by his door, and drove to the community center where the ceremony was being held. The place was filled with quiet faces, many of them veterans, some in uniform, others in plain clothes. There were service dogs there too, sitting patiently beside their handlers. The air carried that familiar mix of respect and sorrow that only those who had served seemed to understand. When the man's name was called, a hush fell over the room. The announcer spoke briefly about his service and the bond between him and his dog, how they had saved lives together, how their story had touched people far beyond their small town. Then they unveiled the plaque, and there, among other names, was his dog's. He stepped forward slowly, placed the collar in front of the plaque, and rested his hand on it for a moment. His expression didn't change, but his eyes glistened slightly in the light. It wasn't pride he felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude that the world had not forgotten his friend. After the ceremony, several people came up to speak with him. A young soldier said quietly, "Sir, your story made me rethink how I treat my own dog. I didn't realize how much they understand us." The man gave a small smile. "They understand more than we do," he said. As the evening ended, he stayed behind for a while, sitting alone near the plaque. The hall had emptied, the lights dimmed, and the echo of footsteps faded. He took one last look before leaving, feeling lighter than when he arrived. The following weeks brought more letters, this time from across the country. People shared how the story had changed the way they viewed their pets, or how it reminded them to be more patient, more kind. The man never sought attention, but he couldn't deny that something good had grown from the tragedy. Still, not everyone was kind. Some people on social media argued about what happened, turning the story into debates and opinions. He ignored it all. He knew that once the noise of the world got involved, truth often became blurred. He didn't need anyone to pick sides. He only wanted people to understand compassion. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sky fade from orange to purple, the reporter called again. "Someone from the state police training program wants to talk to you," she said. "They've been reviewing cases like yours to improve how officers handle animal calls. They'd like to hear your thoughts." He hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted to speak with anyone in uniform again, but he also knew that change only happens when people are willing to share what they've learned, so he agreed to meet them. At the meeting, the officers who greeted him were respectful, almost cautious. They listened carefully as he spoke, not in anger but with clarity. He explained how fear often comes from misunderstanding, and how understanding begins with slowing down. He told them how one moment of patience could save a life. By the end of the conversation, one of the senior officers said quietly, "You've given us more insight than any training manual ever could." The man nodded, not out of pride, but acknowledgement. "Then make it count," he said simply. When he returned home that evening, the sky was full of stars. He stood in the yard, hands in his pockets, looking at the open space where his dog used to run. The grass had started to grow evenly again, and he thought it was time to plant something there. The next day, he bought a small tree, a young oak, and planted it right in that spot. He worked the soil carefully, pressing it down with his palms the same way he had once brushed his dog's fur. As days passed, he watered it every morning. It became part of his routine. Watching the small tree grow gave him a sense of peace, as if life was finding a way to continue in another form. Months went by, and the world around him slowly forgot the headlines. But the lessons remained. The local police department had started a new training initiative inspired by his story. The reporter continued to write about empathy and community healing, and the small oak tree in his yard grew stronger each week. Sometimes neighbors would stop by and comment on it. "That's a fine tree," one man said. "Looks like it's meant to be there." The man would nod, smiling softly. "It is," he'd reply. At night, when everything was quiet, he often sat near the tree with a cup of coffee, looking up at the stars. He didn't speak aloud, but in his heart, he felt like he was having a conversation, one that didn't need words. He knew the pain would never fully leave, but it no longer felt sharp. It had become something gentler, something that reminded him of love rather than loss, and in that quiet acceptance he found a kind of strength he hadn't felt in years. The story that began with sorrow was slowly turning into one of healing, not just for him, but for everyone who had listened. Time had softened the pain, but the memories never left him. The man had learned to live quietly again, carrying the past with calm acceptance. The small oak tree he had planted where his dog once played had grown taller, its leaves wide and green. Every morning when sunlight touched the branches, it felt like a small sign that life goes on, even after loss. The town had also changed in quiet ways. People no longer looked at him with pity, but with a kind of gentle respect. They had seen how he handled tragedy, with dignity, without anger, without shouting. His story had become a reminder of patience and understanding. Some people called him wise. Others said he had strength most couldn't understand. He didn't think of himself that way. He just knew that staying bitter wouldn't bring peace to anyone. One afternoon, the reporter who had told his story returned again. She had become more like a friend now, visiting from time to time, always bringing calm conversation instead of questions. That day she brought a small folder with her. "I wanted you to see this," she said, placing it gently on the table. Inside were letters and photographs from police departments around the country. Many had used his story in their training programs. Officers had written about how it changed the way they approached tense situations, especially those involving pets or frightened owners. Some wrote that they now take extra time before acting, remembering what his dog had gone through. He read each letter slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "I didn't think anyone would remember," he said quietly. "They did," she replied. "You gave them something real to think about." He nodded, not out of pride but out of quiet gratitude. He had never planned to teach anyone anything. He had only told the truth. Yet somehow that truth had grown, spreading farther than he ever expected. That evening, after she left, he sat outside as the sky turned deep orange. The wind moved gently through the oak leaves, and he thought about how one small story, his story, had touched so many. He realized that maybe healing doesn't come from forgetting, but from sharing what hurts so others can learn from it. A few days later, he received a phone call from a veteran organization. They were hosting a gathering to honor service animals and their handlers, and they wanted him to attend as a guest speaker. He hesitated at first. Public speaking was never something he enjoyed. But the person on the phone said softly, "You don't have to talk much. Just tell us what he meant to you." He agreed. The event was held in a large community hall filled with people from different walks of life: veterans, officers, families, and dog handlers. Pictures of dogs in uniform lined the walls, each one a story of loyalty and service. When it was his turn to speak, he walked slowly to the front, holding a small photo of his dog in his hand. He looked out at the crowd for a long moment before saying a word. Then in his calm, low voice he began. "I didn't come here to talk about loss," he said. "I came to talk about what love and trust can do. My partner wasn't just a dog. He was my teammate. He saved lives. He reminded me what loyalty really means. And even after he was gone, he kept teaching people how to be better." The room was silent, every eye on him. His words were simple, but they carried weight. "When you work with a dog like that," he continued, "you learn something about silence. You learn that understanding doesn't need noise. You learn that sometimes all it takes to stop something bad from happening is to take a breath, to wait just one more second before reacting." He paused and looked down at the photo. If my story can remind anyone to take that breath, then maybe it means he's still doing his job. When he finished, the audience stood in quiet applause. No one shouted or cheered. It was the kind of silence that meant respect. A few people wiped their eyes. He gave a small nod and stepped off the stage, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. After the event, a young woman approached him. She was a new police recruit, not older than her mid-20s. She held out her hand and said, "Sir, I just wanted to thank you. I joined because I wanted to help people. But your story reminded me that helping starts with listening." He smiled softly and shook her hand. "That's a good place to start," he said. In the weeks that followed, the veteran organization shared a recording of his short speech online. People around the country watched it and shared their own stories in the comments. Stories about pets, about patience, about loss and growth. It became something more than just a tragedy. It became a lesson people carried with them. One morning, he received a letter from a young boy who wrote, I used to be afraid of dogs, but after hearing about yours, I asked my mom if we could adopt one. We did. His name is Buddy, and he makes me feel safe." The man smiled as he read it, folding the letter carefully. He didn't know the boy, but somehow that message meant more than any medal or ceremony ever could. The seasons changed. The oak tree grew stronger, its branches thickening. Birds began to build nests in it, and sometimes he would sit under the shade watching them flutter in and out. The house that once felt lonely now felt alive again, filled with quiet reminders of the life he had shared with his dog. But life has a way of testing peace. One late afternoon, as he sat by the porch, 2 police cars pulled into his street. He watched quietly as officers went to a house nearby. They seemed tense but careful. The memory of that sound, the doors closing, the radios crackling, brought back an old ache, but it didn't overwhelm him this time. He stood up and watched from his gate. This time he saw something different. The officers didn't rush. They spoke softly. One of them even crouched down to calm a frightened dog on the neighbor's porch. He realized they were doing exactly what he had hoped they would, moving with patience, not fear. When they left, one of the officers looked toward him and gave a small nod, almost as if to say, "We remember." The man nodded back, a faint smile touching his lips. That night he sat under the oak tree again, looking up at the stars through the branches. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that something good had come from his pain. His dog's life, and even his loss, had made the world a little more careful, a little more kind. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the soft rustle of leaves. It almost sounded like breathing, steady, calm, alive. In the following months, the reporter came by once more. She told him that a documentary filmmaker wanted to feature his story, but only if he was comfortable. He thought about it for a long while. Then he said, "If it helps people remember what kindness looks like, I'll do it." The film was quiet and respectful, showing simple moments, his walks, the oak tree, the small house that had become a symbol of resilience. He didn't speak much in it, but the few words he did say were honest and true. When it aired, it moved people deeply, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Messages came again, from all over. Some were from strangers, others from people who said they had once been quick to judge but had changed their ways after hearing his story. One message simply said, "You reminded me to slow down before reacting." He kept those messages in a box beside his desk. Every once in a while, he'd open it and read a few, smiling to himself. They were reminders that even quiet voices could create echoes. As time passed, he didn't dwell on the pain anymore. He had found a rhythm again, mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons tending to the tree, evenings under the stars. And though he was alone, he never felt lonely. The world had taken something from him, but it had also given something back: understanding, connection, peace. One early morning, as the first light touched the leaves of the oak, he whispered softly, "You did your job well, my friend. Even now you're still helping me." The wind moved gently, brushing against the branches as if answering him, and for the first time in a long while the man smiled. Not from memory, but from hope. Years passed quietly, and the man grew older, though his eyes still held that steady calmness that people remembered. The small town had become livelier. New families had moved in, and children often played near the big oak tree that stood tall at the corner of his yard. The tree had become something of a landmark. People would say, "That's where he planted it," as if everyone knew the meaning behind it. He didn't talk much about the past anymore, but sometimes when the neighborhood kids asked, he would smile and tell them small things. "He was brave," he'd say softly when they asked about his dog, "and he never gave up on me." The children would listen with wide eyes, sitting cross-legged in the grass as he told them stories about friendship and loyalty. Without ever making them sad, one of those kids, a quiet boy who lived 2 houses down, started visiting often. He would bring his small brown puppy, always wagging its tail and stumbling over its own paws. The man taught the boy how to train it gently, never shouting, never pulling the leash too hard. "Patience," he said one afternoon, watching the boy and his dog play. "They listen better when they trust you." The boy nodded, repeating the words like a promise. It reminded the man of his younger days, days filled with early morning drills, long walks, and his loyal companion beside him. Watching the boy grow closer to his dog brought him comfort. It felt like a quiet continuation of something once lost but never forgotten. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he received a letter in the mail. It was from a small film studio that had made the documentary about him years ago. They were planning to create a short follow-up, an update on how things had changed since then. He wasn't sure about it at first. Life had become peaceful and he didn't want attention. But after reading their words, he decided to agree. They arrived a few weeks later, respectful and calm, setting up simple cameras under the oak tree. There were no bright lights, no fancy setups. They just wanted to talk. The interviewer asked, "Do you ever feel angry about what happened back then?" He paused for a long moment before answering. "I used to, but anger only keeps the wound open. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you've decided to stop letting it hurt you every day." The interviewer nodded quietly. "Besides," he continued, "I saw what came from it. I've met people who changed because they heard the story. If something good came from it, then it wasn't all loss. When the short film came out, it touched people deeply again. It showed not just the pain of the past, but the peace he had found in the present. People online commented that his calmness made them think differently about how they treat others. Some said they shared it with their children to teach them empathy. Others wrote that it reminded them that real strength is quiet, not loud. One afternoon, he got another call, this time from a large military base. They were hosting a ceremony for veterans and service animals, and they wanted to dedicate a small plaque in memory of his dog. They asked if he would come. He said yes. When he arrived, the ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, and several dogs in service vests sat beside them, calm and alert. A small brass plaque was placed at the base of a flagpole. It read, "In honor of loyal partners who served with courage and gave without hesitation." He stood there for a while after the ceremony ended, the sound of the flag fluttering above him. The memory of his dog felt close again, not painful this time, but warm. He could almost feel that familiar weight leaning against his leg, the quiet breathing beside him. Afterward, a young officer approached him. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I watched your story when I was still in training. It changed how I see people. It reminded me that we never really know what someone has been through. I just wanted to thank you." The man shook his hand and smiled. "That means more than you know." When he returned home, the sun was setting. The oak tree cast long shadows across the yard, and he sat beneath it, feeling the cool air of evening settle in. He thought about all the people he had met since that day. The ones who learned, the ones who listened, the ones who found kindness again. It was strange how a single moment once filled with pain had become a thread that connected so many lives. That night, he dreamed of his dog. In the dream, they were walking through a wide open field. The grass moved softly in the wind, and his companion trotted ahead, turning back once in a while as if to make sure he was following. There was no fear, no noise, no sorrow, just quiet peace. When he woke, the morning light filled the room gently. He sat up slowly and smiled. The dream had felt real, as if his old friend had stopped by to check on him one last time. In the following weeks, the boy with the puppy continued to visit. His dog had grown stronger and more obedient, and the man could see how much love the boy had put into raising it. One day, the boy brought a small wooden tag he had carved himself. On it, he had written, "For your hero." The man's eyes softened as he accepted it. "Thank you," he said quietly. He'd like that. He tied the tag to a low branch of the oak tree where the wind could touch it. Every time the breeze blew, the tag would move slightly, catching the sunlight. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. The man spent most of his time writing small notes, memories of moments with his dog, thoughts about patience and kindness. He never planned to publish them, but he wrote them anyway, saying it helped him feel connected. One evening, the boy's mother came by. "He reads your stories every day," she said with a smile. "He's started writing his own now." "That's good," the man replied softly. "Stories keep the good things alive," she nodded. "He says you taught him that." He looked out at the oak tree again, its branches sway,